Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So let's continue with the main arguments used against the men's rights movement, and we'll go through some more and debunk them. Just one note though before we get to it, and that is I say in the next segment earlier in this video, I actually mean episode 50, and the reason for that is because the next segment was originally meant to be at the end of 50, but I bumped it to 51 just for reasons of timing. But on that note, let's get stuck into it. Women worsting, or as I like to call it, women thirsting, because it basically puts women first every single time, no matter what the circumstances. Now, I think the term women worsting was coined by Alison from the Honey Badgers, and it basically says that no matter what, women always have it worse. No matter what the actual evidence presented says, women somehow always have it worse. Let me give you some very common examples. We have the sentencing gap, where men get much longer sentences for the exact same crimes committed by women when they have similar arrest history and it's a similar crime and all the circumstances are basically the same. Men are twice as likely to go to jail and get 63% longer sentences because they're male. Yet we are told by feminists that women have it worse, even though they are fucking privileged when it comes to committing crime, even though the legal system bends over backwards to make excuses for them and to give them a slap on the wrist. Even then, we have feminists who insist that it is worse for women and that we should just give them no sentence whatsoever. We should close down women's prisons, apparently. Another example is when we bring up male circumcision. The response we get all the fucking time is female circumcision is worse. Now, what they do when they claim this is they take the very, very worst case scenario of female circumcision and compare it to the very, very best case scenario of male circumcision.
Well, they're two very different issues. I mean, especially if you consider like North African female genital mutilation, it's much more severe than mere male circumcision. It's often removal of the entire clitoris. Sometimes, at least in places like Somalia, it involves actually sewing up the vagina throughout pubescence until the woman's married. So
I agree, but that doesn't mean that male genital mutilation isn't.
That's exactly what I was talking about. It has to be which one has it worse. It's not just this is a human rights violation to chop up a child's genitals. It's but women have it worse, so we have to make that.
Well, I'm not remotely trying to discredit the case against male circumcision, but I do think that there's sort of two different issues that are practiced in two very different circumstances, and one of them is much more severe than the other one. And I think that the fact that it's more severe means that there's some legitimacy in having a group that's focused specifically on that.
If they focused on genital mutilation in general, that it's a human rights violation, not which is worse, just that it's a human rights violation.
The circumstances
why can't I keep it for AIDS?
The circumstances aren't different.
Caring about malaria.
No. The circumstances aren't different. Both were done to.
They are different. Very different cultures. Very different geographic.
No. If you look at
very different consequences.
If you look at genital cutting of males in Africa, it's done under exactly the same circumstances.
No, it just isn't. I mean, it's often.
It is. Males in Africa, they're teenage boys. They have their genitals cut by people who aren't medical professions in unhygienic conditions, often using glass or rusty knives or whatever. It results in infections, sometimes amputation of the penis, and quite often death. Every year there are deaths because of this. We can only compare the worst case female circumcision to the best case male circumcision. And that's a bullshit argument.
I think that's like part of the big problem is when people talk about genital cutting, they do think about the fourth one of FGM. That's the worst. Then they think about like a really sterile, safe situation like in America. So it's it's
the real question.
Exactly. Well, but I mean, the original question was like, why does this always come up? And I think that's exactly why, because people are thinking of the worst female genital mutilation versus probably just normal everyday circumcision.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It should just be at its base. It's a human rights violation. Everybody has the right to intact genitals. Period. There's no other argument to be made.
And of course, there is male suicide. Male suicide victims vastly outnumber female victims. Yet whenever we try to bring it up, we get told that more women attempt suicide.
Part of what gave me that breaking point was when I started to explain to my feminist friends men's issues that I really did think they had the statistics to back them in the studies and to support what the MRAs are saying. And so then I would try to relay that message to my feminist friends, and then I saw their unwillingness to listen and just be dismissive towards these issues. And I realized I was doing that too, but I did have a breaking point where I started to think, no, we should, for instance, let's use an example with suicide. 78% of all suicides around the world are men. And the common reaction you'll get from feminists is saying that more women attempt suicide. And what I learned from the men's rights movement is they aren't trying to dismiss women's issues, or they're not saying that no woman is ever raped or no woman is ever abused by her spouse, but they're trying to bring up issues that men face. Mm-hmm. But when you do that, instantly feminists, or even people who don't wear feminism on their sleeve, but just are the kind of mainstream liberal, seemingly open-minded person.
Seemingly open-minded, yeah. That seems to be a theme around a lot of the stuff I talk about, yeah.
Seemingly. And so they'll have these quick, responses that are, in essence, diminishing what the men's issue is, like saying, well, more women attempt. But yes, but still, 78% of all suicides are men.
Now, not only is this an incredibly bad argument, because it's comparing people who are dead to people who are not dead, and saying the people who are not dead are somehow have it worse. I don't know how exactly that works, but apparently attempting suicide is somehow worse than actually succeeding in the minds of feminists. So not only is it an incredibly bad argument, but it's also false. You see, the actual statistic is that more women self-harm, but not all self-harm is suicide attempts. Now, the self-harm figures aren't actually broken down, so we don't know what percentage of women who self-harm are attempting suicide. We don't know if it's 10% or 90% or 50% or whatever. And I suspect there's a pretty big grey area in between, where it's basically unsure whether the self-harm was a suicide attempt or not. But it's pretty clear that you can't state for a fact that more women attempt suicide. Yet that is what we hear constantly from the feminists as a response to us trying to talk about male suicide. And then, of course, there was the Hillary Clinton quote, which said, "Women have always been the primary victims of war. Women lose their husbands, their fathers, their sons in combat. Women often have to flee from the only homes they have ever known. Women are often the refugees from conflicts, and sometimes more frequently in today's warfare, victims. Women are often left with the responsibility alone of raising the children." So she ignores the fact that many of the things she listed there also happen to men. Fathers lose their sons, not just mothers. Boys lose their fathers. And of course, men also have to flee the only homes they've ever known during war. Unless, of course, they stay behind to defend those homes and end up getting killed, which is apparently the better option than fleeing, right? And of course, there are no male refugees anywhere, apparently. And yes, it is true, women are often left with the responsibility of raising children when the father has died in war. Which personally I think is probably the better option than being blown to pieces in a foreign land. I don't know, call me crazy. I think I'd prefer to raise my kids than to be killed if I was given those two options. So what is the origin of women worsting or women firsting? And it goes back once again to an earlier segment in this video where I mentioned the feminist lens or the feminist worldview with the dichotomy of the oppressor class and the oppressed class. So basically, because of this dichotomy, because of this ideology, this worldview where you have to have one class oppressing the other, it can't be both groups having issues and advantages and disadvantages. There has to be one oppressing the other. Therefore, they cannot allow men to have issues in which it's worse for them, because admitting that would be allowing cracks in their ideology, pretty fucking big cracks. In fact, their whole ideology would pretty soon crumble to pieces. So no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the evidence is that is presented, it always has to be viewed or twisted in such a way as to make it worse for the supposed oppressed class, for women. There can't possibly be a situation where there's an advantage for women. I've even seen this in cases where we bring up the disparity in the family court, where men are getting screwed over constantly when it comes to custody. You will still have feminists who will fuck around with statistics and lie in an attempt to say, oh, it's nowhere near as bad as what these people claim. In fact, it's not bad at all. And what they'll do is they'll take fathers who don't want custody and fathers who have come to agreements with their ex-partner, and they'll mix them in with the fathers who do want custody but can't get it, to try to water them down and to try to distract from that, and then try to dismiss it as not a big deal at all. Now, if that's the case, if it's not a big deal at all, and it's not as bad as we say it is, then why are so many men committing suicide after a divorce and after they lose their kids? Now, this one is getting harder for the feminists to use, because the men's rights movement is gaining ground all the time, and men's issues are becoming more mainstream. Suicide, for example, the suicide rate is becoming more mainstream knowledge now. Slowly, but we're getting there. And the more that happens, the harder it is for these feminists to dismiss these issues as unimportant or less important or not important at all. Now, just to finish up, I should explain that feminist ideology is actually built upon a circular argument. It starts out by saying that women are oppressed. So when you ask a feminist why are women oppressed, they will give you a list of women's issues. So the counter to this is to explain that men have issues too, at which point they will explain to you that women's issues are more important. And you'll ask, why are women's issues more important? At which point they'll explain to you that women's issues are more important because women are oppressed. So women's issues are more important because women are oppressed, and women are oppressed because their issues are more important. And around we go in the circular argument. Each assumption based on the other assumption.
I get why they're upset. I don't get, rationally, why men's rights activists are so upset. I don't think that there is a rational basis for a political movement like this. And I've said this before, and people have accused me of being biased or being anti-male or being too pro-feminist or drinking the feminist Kool-Aid or whatever. You can point out to me areas where men have been mistreated in our society, where men have been mistreated by women, where men have suffered because of favoritism shown to women. And I don't deny that. But that doesn't mean that men as a class, as a category of people, are persecuted. Much less persecuted by women. There's a difference between pointing out cases where men have been mistreated, or pointing out areas of our culture where men fall behind women, and describing men as a whole as a persecuted class or a disempowered class or an underprivileged class. That is absurd.
Men's rights activists just hate women. Now, it's a very simple, straightforward argument. Well, claim, really. It's really not an argument. But the question is, why is this claim made? And, well, there's actually a number of reasons. One reason, it has to do with what we've already talked about, the feminist lens, how they see the world with the oppressor class and the oppressed class. Now, if men are the oppressor class and women are the oppressed class, and there's a group of men talking about their issues, then it's the oppressors putting their needs ahead of the people they're oppressing, which is interpreted as hateful, right? Because obviously the oppressed should be put first. Now, as I've already explained, this worldview is just not realistic because both men and women have issues. Both men and women have advantages and disadvantages, and it's not men to blame, it's society to blame for these things. But when you look at the world as the oppressor group complaining about their issues and putting those issues above the oppressed group, then yeah, you can understand when someone has that worldview that they might see it as hateful. Another reason we get this is because, as I've already discussed previously a couple of times now, feminists love to falsely associate anyone they don't like with the men's rights movement. So whenever you get a troll on Twitter or Bruce V or any other pickup artist or an anti-feminist or anyone, someone from the alt-right, anyone who says anything which is in any way critical of a woman or women in general, or even going to the point of actually being misogynistic, it will automatically be associated with the men's rights movement, even if it's not said by anyone from the movement itself. It's just assumed that that's what men's rights activists think, therefore the person making the statement must be an MRA, and then this is proof that MRAs think this way. Once again, this is a feminist circular argument. They really love those circular arguments where you've got two pieces of evidence which support each other and nothing else to hold it up. So another reason, which is probably the most important one to discuss, is the fact that the feminist movement has been extremely clever, or maybe cunning is a better word. They've been extremely cunning in making the word feminist and woman synonymous in the minds of many people. So when someone criticizes feminism, which is an ideology, which has beliefs, which should be criticized, as all belief systems should, to keep them honest, the focus is then shifted to half the world's population. Suddenly it doesn't become an argument about how unfair it is that domestic violence laws are gendered and often male victims get arrested for being perpetrators simply because they're male. I mean, that would be, an actual hard argument to argue against, right? I mean, because that sounds pretty fucked up. So it's much easier just to shift the focus and say the person making the argument just hates women. Automatically must be a misogynist, automatically hates women. Ignore the argument and instead just attack the person. Now, it's interesting because if we lived in a patriarchy like feminists claim, this wouldn't be a very effective strategy. However, it would be an extremely effective strategy if society was gynocentric. And that's exactly why it works. We live in a gynocentric society where we put concern and the well-being of women over men, and when someone claims a woman is being attacked, there will be men who will come to her defense as well as women. Now, you could argue that these are outdated gender roles which feminists are fighting against, yet it's the very thing that they plug themselves into and take full advantage of. So let me give you an example which is rather amusing. I'm going to play a clip from Jenny McDermott, and she's talking about women being harassed online.
How? For one, they're YouTubers with larger channels who have a ton of influence, and they use this platform to attack women like Rebecca Watson, Anita Sarkeesian, Lacey Green, Marina Shut Up, Zenistrad1, Ryan Wiley, Kevin Logan.
Now, did you pick that up? She says women are being harassed online because, basically because they're women. There's no other reason, possible reason. And then she starts naming a large group of people, and the last three names she says are actually male. Unless Kevin Logan has become a trans woman or something. If you have, Kev, look, I'll fully support you, mate. Might want to shave the beard, but, I'm right behind you, mate. Of course, an alternative explanation, apart from Kevin Logan becoming a trans woman, would be that Jenny is actually talking about feminists. But because feminist and woman are so tied together in her mind, she said woman. And, and to be fair, she's probably going to get more sympathy that way, right? So saying someone is attacking women is a much more effective argument than saying they are criticizing an ideology. Now, here's an interesting point that I'd like to put to any feminists watching. If criticizing feminism makes you a sexist, because essentially it's attacking women, then wouldn't criticizing the men's rights movement also make you a sexist? Oh, sorry, I forgot. We're dealing with double standards here, right?
You might not say in your mind, I hate women, and that's why I'm saying this. But the practical result is the same.
If you don't want feminism associated with man-hating, then don't associate the men's rights movement with women-hating. All the MRAs I have met have huge amounts of respect for women, which is why they often oppose feminism, as it tends to paint women as nothing but weak victims in need of rescuing. Not being a feminist isn't synonymous with being a sexist. The men's rights movement is not the opposite of feminism. They are the balance, speaking about issues largely ignored by feminism because feminism is about women's rights. Men deserve a voice, and they don't hate women for wanting that. When I went through my battle with cancer, while I did receive some support from feminists, the vast majority of the support I received was from men's rights activists and anti-feminists. Doesn't sound like they hate women, does it? Often, the heavily sexist people that get labeled as men's rights activists aren't even MRAs, but extremist MGTOWs or pickup artists. Try asking some real MRAs their viewpoints, rather than hurling the label at anyone that disagrees with you.
I do perceive anti-woman voices to be representative of the greater part of the men's rights movement.
Now, continuing on from the last segment, there is one other reason why feminists commonly say that MRAs just hate women. And considering this one is used so often, I thought it deserved its own little segment. And that's what I like to call the Paul Elam 3. So the Paul Elam 3 are basically 3 articles written by Paul Elam out of probably hundreds that he's written. And these articles are constantly used and selectively quoted to prove that all MRAs everywhere are evil, misogynistic women haters. So before having a brief look at these articles, let's play devil's advocate just for a second, shall we? And let's say, for example, just for the sake of argument, that the feminists are right, and let's say that these 3 articles are evil, misogynistic, women-hating propaganda or whatever, right? If this is true, then they are basically judging an entire movement based on 3 articles written by one person within that movement. Now, if we were to play exactly the same game with feminists, I think it would be easy to prove that feminism is a hate movement, right? If all we needed was 3 articles by one feminist, it would be pretty easy. Now, to be fair, Paul is a very prominent MRA, possibly the most prominent MRA, but I think it's only fair that we have a quick look at these 3 articles and ask the question, are they what the feminists claim, and also, more importantly, ask why were they written, because context is always important. Now, I'm only going to look at these articles very briefly for the sake of time. I have touched on all of them in the past, and they probably deserve a video or a series of videos going through them in great detail, which I might get around to doing sometime in the future. So I'm not going to go through every single word here, obviously, but just talk about the overall gist of each article. So let's start with the one that I personally have defended numerous times. So the article is called, "If You See Jezebel in the Road, Run the Bitch Down." Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is a play on "If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him," which, for the record, is a very good book by Sheldon B. Kopp. Now, the one bit of this article which is quoted to death is Paul saying, "I am proclaiming October to be Bash a Violent Bitch Month." Now, those of you who paid close attention in the last segment may have noticed this overlay. It's of an article by feminist Melinda Tankard-Reist, and the heading of the article is "Bash a Bitch, How Men's Rights Activists Hate Women." Now, you'll note here that she's got quotation marks around the quote, yet she's taken out the word violent. Now, she's not the only one who has done this before.
So, back to this men's rights conference that this wonderful Bash a Bitch Month author put together.
So if you're not familiar with this article, you may be asking what's the big deal about leaving out the word violent, and it's actually very important because it's all about context. You see, the article in question is a response to another article from Jezebel, an article which is never ever quoted along with this quote from Paul Elam. In other words, the quote is never given in its proper context. So let's go have a quick look at that Jezebel article. It's called "Have You Ever Beat Up a Boyfriend? Because, we have." And yeah, it's as bad as it sounds. It's actually the some writers from Jezebel talking about how at various times they've beaten their boyfriends and then they laugh about it. So you can see in proper context what Paul was replying to. And he was doing it sarcastically. He doesn't really believe that October should be Bash a Violent Bitch Month. His whole point was to say what would happen if we said something like this, and we found out, because all the feminist journalists lost their shit. Yet surprisingly, not one of them, to my knowledge, has ever criticised the original article which Paul was replying to, which wasn't sarcasm, but actually talking about acts of violence. This shows an incredible double standard in the media. The fact that the article is quoted without context constantly, and in some cases, as I've just shown, not only selectively quoted, but the quote itself is edited and changed. It just shows how corrupt these people are. Okay, now that I've dealt with the easier one of the three, let's go on to the other two. These ones are a bit trickier and a bit more controversial. So the next article in question is called "Jury Duty at a Rape Trial, Acquit." Now, the quote which is constantly taken from this article, selectively taken from this article, is, "Should I be called to sit on a jury for a rape trial, I vow publicly to vote not guilty, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that the charges are true." Now, this quote appears fucking everywhere, even in the recent petition to stop the Palace Cinemas showing the Red Pill movie. We find this quote. We find it all over the place whenever feminists are talking about men's rights activists.
Can I say something here?
Go.
Well, yes, it would be good to see the movie, but looking here, it talks about people who are pro-rape racists in the film. We have no problems, as we should not, banning people from visiting Australia preaching hate. Aren't these people preaching hate who are in this film?
We don't know, because we haven't seen it.
But though obviously some people have seen it.
No, the bit about the pro-rape, the guy said, if he was in a court, in a jury, and there was overwhelming evidence that the rape occurred, he'd still vote not guilty.
Now, obviously, that guy.
But he didn't say that in the movie. He said this previous. So he's got form, but
still. So yeah, I must say I disagree with you guys.
You think?
So, admittedly, this is a pretty controversial thing. Something that I know a lot of MRAs, and including myself, have criticised Paul over. Now, why did Paul make this comment? What is the context of this statement? Now, to understand that, we need to actually go and look at the article. Not surprisingly, a lot of the feminist articles which quote this don't actually link to the original article. If they have a link at all, it's usually to We Hunted the Mammoth or some other feminist article which is also talking about it. They tend to avoid the original source if they can. Interesting that. It's almost like they don't want you to read it in context. Anyway, at the start of the article it says this, and I think it's a good summary of why this isn't as bad as many people think, and explains the reasoning of Paul.
Editorial note: in the early years of A Voice for Men, when it first started, deliberately inflammatory articles were often written in order to shake people out of their comfortable sensibilities and confront brutal realities they just did not want to see. This tiny handful of old articles is cited time and again by critics of the men's human rights movement's literature as typical, and the sort of thing you see all the time, or in a steady stream, when, rather tellingly, these are almost always articles at least a few years old and actually rather unusual. In this particularly controversial essay, Paul Elam asks a provocative question: if you truly believe you cannot trust police, prosecutors, or judges to make sure you get the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, when rape shield laws withhold exculpatory evidence, how can you in good conscience trust anything you see in a court of law, no matter how damning the evidence might look? It is an uncomfortable question, but it is rather telling that in the years since this was written, almost everyone continues to bring up this old article without ever addressing the substance of it, but instead just emotionally characterize it as, Paul Elam says men should get away with rape, when what he actually says could not be more clear. Due process and presumed innocence have been undermined, and until that changes, how can you in good conscience convict a man of practically anything?
Overall, it's a fairly good article which makes some really good points. Although, let me be clear, I don't agree with Paul on that particular quote in question, and the quote seems to have been removed from the article. But what about the third article? It's called Challenging the Etymology of Rape. Now, the interesting thing is when I went to reread this article, it seems to have been removed, and there is a brief explanation as to why. So let's have a look at that.
Editorial note: we find it fascinating that this article, written in 2010, is still frequently cited by the mainstream media and critics of the men's human rights movement as typical of the views of the movement and or this website. The truth is, this was written in the very early days of A Voice for Men to be deliberately provocative, to get attention and challenge people to think. It was, to use a phrase feminist Camille Paglia once used, a necessary savaging of a once taboo subject. Today the culture at large is beginning to acknowledge that both men and women can and do engage in abusive behavior that can provoke violent, dangerous reactions in psychotic and irresponsible individuals, and now that the culture is beginning to recognize that men are at least as likely to be victims of sexual assault as women, and women far more likely to be perpetrators of sexual assault than we like to think, a more mature dialogue seems to be developing on the non-gendered nature of rape and sexual assault and abuse. Many such articles on that have appeared on AVFM in subsequent years, so it seems strange that this old article is still repeatedly gone back to by critics. Why, out of the countless thousands written on this site, pick this one and hold it up as typical, when it is simply not? From our point of view, we think its intentionally provocative style no longer serves its intended purpose, and it's being obsessed over by people who want to avoid thinking hard about complex issues. We think it mostly tends to be quoted out of context by dishonest ideologues as typical, rather than the unusually provocative article that it was. Therefore, with reluctance, we are removing it from our archives.
It mentions here the intentionally provocative style. So let's discuss why the second and third article in particular had a very provocative style, and they are both from 2010. Now, I seem to recall Paul saying at some point in a hangout or something, I can't remember exactly where, that no one was paying attention to the men's rights movement until he started writing articles like this, and then suddenly everyone started to pay attention to him. And I've often thought that new political movements who aren't known by the mainstream need to do something to get known, right? They need some kind of publicity or something, because if the mainstream doesn't know that you even exist, then you don't stand a chance in hell of changing their mind. I mean, we saw this with Emily Davison, the suffragette, who was killed at Epsom Derby. Now, her motivations weren't clear. Some people think she was just trying to put a banner on a horse, or some think she did it on purpose to get killed, or whatever. But the result, regardless of that, was the same. It was a publicity stunt. And by getting publicity, even bad publicity, you spread awareness that your group exists. And once people know that you exist, then you can start spreading your other message, your proper message. So in many ways, I think this is a necessary evil. The alternative is basically being ignored and having the movement die. Now, I can give you a very good example of this. I used the Red Pill petition earlier in this segment on purpose, because it's a very real possibility that if it wasn't for the Paul Elam 3, that there wouldn't be a Red Pill movie. It's quite possible that Cassie Jaye would not have come across A Voice for Men. She wouldn't have spent time investigating men's issues and talking to MRAs. And she wouldn't have eventually given up being a feminist. She probably would have gone on and made a feminist movie about rape culture and would still be a feminist today. And let's face it, the Red Pill movie is a game changer. It's something which is going to hopefully spread awareness to the mainstream. So if it wasn't for these more provocative articles drawing her in, none of that might have happened. And maybe you wouldn't be watching this video right now. Maybe this video wouldn't even be made without these articles stirring the pot and getting the men's rights movement known. So when you look at it from that point of view, you can say that even though MRAs like myself might disagree with some of the language and some of the arguments, although I don't think all the arguments are wrong, I just disagree with a couple of the key points. But despite that, you could argue that they serve a greater good. Like I said earlier, they might have been a necessary evil at the time. But at the same time, I do think that they are a double-edged sword. Although they may have been very effective in spreading awareness that the movement exists, at the same time, they are constantly used against us. Those three quotes are relentlessly used against us. And once again, I very purposely used the petition against the Red Pill to illustrate that. Not only were those articles possibly the cause for the movie to be made in the first place, but they also hindered it being shown in certain places. And to be perfectly honest, I'm sick and tired of coming across articles which quote the Paul Elam 3. Pretty much these three quotes are the only quotes that feminists actually take from MRAs. Now, there are obvious exceptions to this, but as a general rule, the only quotes that they will give you from actual MRAs are these three quotes. Now, they'll give you lots of other quotes, but, you know, they're usually from Return of Kings or Roosh V or whoever. So, like I said, I think these quotes are really a double-edged sword. I think they stirred the pot early on. They caused controversy and spread awareness of the men's rights movement, right, which was a necessary evil at the time. But I also think there's a very negative side to them as well. And in many ways, they're handing our opposition ammo to fire back at us. But regardless of all that, like I said at the start of this segment, we are talking about three quotes from three articles written by one man. 3 articles out of hundreds he's written. And I think Paul would be the first one to agree that the articles, and more specifically the quotes, do not represent all MRAs or even the mainstream movement. In fact, it even said that in the sections from the articles I quoted. But I'll let you make up your own mind on this one.
But I would also add that Paul was modest in some ways in his response, because what Paul has done is he has provoked people in some ways. He's gotten people upset enough so that people start listening. Warren's been working at this for much longer than both Paul and I. He's always been nice. He's never gotten to the same point that we have now with the red pill, and a part of it is because Paul tends to provoke. Am I right, Paul, or not?
I think so. I think Cassie would tell you that. The reason this movie got made is because I wrote very provocative, offensive satire that was predominantly anti-feminist. Yeah. Trust me, I looked at this movement, the 100-year history of attempts to get this movement off the ground. And I looked at all the approaches that were squelched, that were suppressed, where people had careers destroyed and were silenced by feminist ideologues trying to get this movement off the ground. And I decided that the only way that we were going to get a conversation rolling at all was with some provocation. But that is not to say that I want there to be an unreasonable standard for discussion on this. I want to echo Tom's thanks to you for coming and for raising this question. I think it's an important one, but I will qualify that by saying that I think that we both need to be willing on both sides of the fence to hear the experience of the other side. Yes. And our experience on this side of it has been that feminists just want us to shut up and go away, period.
I'd like to say a few things about jury nullification in regards to this article. And that should really clarify a lot to anybody who understands what jury nullification is. If you Google jury nullification right now, the first link that you'll find is from a anti-police type of site. And there's a reason for that. Jury nullification puts the power in the jury's hands. Now, the jury already has the power, but they're not always aware that they have the power. A lot of times they feel that their job is just to find the facts. A lot of times the courts push them in that direction. Your job is simply to evaluate these facts that we present you. But there's a long-standing history going well back into old Europe, but even here in the U.S., where jury nullification actually has some real teeth still. It's been used numerous times. The Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s, where a northerner would have to return an escaped slave to the southern slave owner. Many northerners were not keen on such a thing, and the state would still prosecute them because it was a federal crime, but they found it very difficult to convict because no jury would convict, even though there was overwhelming evidence to say that these people were guilty. We've also seen it used numerous times in the early days of America for going against the crown. The British had a very difficult time getting any convictions on maritime crimes because jury nullification, the people would just know, we're not going to vote guilty, screw you. It's one of the reasons that we have a no double jeopardy clause here in the U.S., where the system can't try a person over and over and over again because they didn't like the verdict they got. They can't keep dragging up more stuff because jury nullification is part of our system. It's part that a lot of people don't like, but it's also a part that a lot of people, legal experts, not just armchair historians, find an absolute critical part and a responsibility, because when somebody is sitting on the jury, they are outside of the legal system, but now they are holding all the power on the legal system. This isn't somebody who works in the legal system. This is somebody from outside of it, but now they hold all this power. It was used numerous times during the Prohibition era. People could say, you know what, I'm not going to convict this guy for running a speakeasy. I like going to his speakeasy, so screw you guys. Now, these are the more common uses when you know somebody committed a crime, but you don't care because you don't think it should be a crime. Now, that's not where Paul's going with this. What Paul is saying, though, is it's about due process. He doesn't believe that the people involved in gathering the evidence are trustworthy. He doesn't believe in the people prosecuting are trustworthy. He doesn't believe the reports are trustworthy. He doesn't believe the shield laws allow somebody to face their accuser. All of these things go against the concept of due process. Many legal experts, again, not just armchair historians, but many legal experts would say that it is a person on the jury's duty to nullify when they believe that that's the case. Now, whether or not you believe the system is as corrupt as Paul says that he believes it is, that doesn't really matter. Paul's experience has told him that he finds this system extremely corrupt, that he finds that people lie about all the aspects of these rape cases in order to get a lot of convictions. For example, Daniel Holtzaw, the police officer, has been found guilty of raping numerous people, sentenced to 236 years in prison, and it's come out that the system basically coerced a number of accusations out of a bunch of people that were less than trustworthy and knew that they were lying. People that flat out knew they were lying, and they have it on tape, but it doesn't matter. He's still in jail right now. He's in prison, and he's going to be there for a long time unless somebody can overturn that conviction, which may happen, but it's going to be a fight. And the fact of the matter is that due process was not involved. Not in a normal way that it should be involved in a trial, not in the way the Constitution lays out, not in the way the Magna Carta laid out. So when it comes to those kinds of situations, you might think that Paul's wrong. I personally don't agree with what Paul is saying here. But from a legal perspective, many, many, many people would say that not only is Paul right, he's being responsible. Anybody who doesn't look at it with the knowledge that Paul has, anybody who wouldn't act the way he does would be irresponsible. I mean, look at it like this. If you were sitting on the jury of a trial and the trial was all about convicting a black man of robbing a liquor store, and you knew that in your local area the police were notorious for convicting black people of robbery wrongfully, for framing them, for lying about them, it's something that you'd seen over and over and over again in the news or had heard from word of mouth. Would you not be skeptical of the evidence? What if the evidence was flimsy and just relied on a few people's statements and no firm evidence? Is it possible that you would go against the law and acquit this man? That's all that Paul's saying. He's not saying that he thinks that men should have the right to rape. He's saying that the juries have the ultimate power. The system is completely screwed up here, and when a person is in the position, they should nullify if they believe that that the situation calls for it. All right, Bane, carry on.
The MRAs don't really care about men's issues or don't give a shit about men. All they really want to do is attack feminists or shit all over feminists. For example, let's look at this clip.
So it's that kind of callousness that leads us to the popular hashtag kill all men.
Jokes at the expense of men. It's the outrage at this kind of thing that shows how the MRA are merely a reactionary movement against feminism. It doesn't have any ideals of its own rather than to oppose what feminism stands for.
Now, what Michael Rowlands did here is he used a very, very common variation of this particular argument. In fact, it's a variation of something we've seen before where someone takes a non-MRA, usually in this case it's an anti-feminist, and they falsely claim that the person is a men's rights activist. Now, what they're doing in this particular case is using a non-MRA as evidence that MRAs don't talk about men's rights issues. Now, the fact that the person isn't talking about men's rights issues might be a bit of a clue that the person isn't a fucking MRA. Now, in this particular case from the clip, you saw it was Sargon, who clearly does not identify as an MRA. He's never claimed to be an MRA. In fact, he has said numerous times that he thinks that we should drop the label. He is sympathetic towards our issues, but he's never claimed to be an MRA. Now, let me give you an example of why this is an incredibly bad argument. Using this logic, if we want to call it logic, because it's not really, but using this logic, we can prove that Muslims don't worship Allah. Right? Now, here is Michael Rowlands, who's a Muslim. He's not really, but going with the feminist argument, Michael Rowlands is a Muslim because I say he is. No other evidence needed. And he doesn't worship Allah. Therefore, it's proof that Muslims don't worship Allah. I mean, it's stupid. It's fucking that stupid, really. Now, the argument we often hear as a counter to the claim that this is a stupid argument is that, well, people like Sargon use exactly the same arguments as MRAs. Really? Because your entire argument against this is he doesn't talk about men's issues. So how can he use the same arguments? Sure, both MRAs and Sargon and people like Sargon are anti-feminist. There is overlap, but that doesn't make him an MRA. So here we have yet another example of feminist circular reasoning. You start by claiming someone is an MRA because, you have a stereotype in your head of what an MRA is. And then you use that as evidence that MRAs don't talk about men's issues, at which point you use that to prove the original assumption that the person is an MRA. Once again, this is a fucking stupid bullshit argument. If you're not talking about men's issues, you're not a fucking MRA. I don't understand how that is so difficult to understand, right? But they just don't seem to get it. So why do they do this? What is the purpose of this? What is the reason they make this claim? Now, once again, I know you've heard this in many previous segments, but it comes down to two things. In some cases, it is sheer ignorance. They've been living in an echo chamber. They've just heard the same fucking bullshit arguments. They haven't bothered to investigate or listen. They've just made assumptions based on stereotypes. And they just conclude that people like Sargon or Teal Deer or the Amazing Atheist or numerous other people who aren't MRAs, they just assume that they are because they criticise feminism. That's apparently the one criteria you need to be an MRA in their minds. Now, the second reason some of them do this is dishonesty. Once again, it's just an easy, cheap shot at the men's rights movement. They can claim that we don't actually care about men's issues, and that way they can actually dismiss any men's issues that we bring up. Now, the interesting thing is, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail here because it's the subject of an upcoming segment, but they actually make a counter-argument against this argument. They actually contradict themselves because they often say that MRAs don't care about black men or trans men or whatever. All they care about is the rights of straight white men, which, as you'll see, is also false. But it's interesting that they make both these arguments because they contradict each other. They say on one hand that we don't care about any men's issues, we just want to shit on feminists, and then they say on the other hand that all we do is talk about straight white men's issues, which technically would be talking about men's issues, wouldn't it? Funny, you can't have it both ways, guys. Which one is it? Which lie are you going to go with? Make up your fucking minds, for you.
I love that Michael Rowlands features in this particular segment, because he is such a great source of double standards. He, like many feminists, would claim that the MRA are a reactionary group for not being able to take what he calls a joke. But when a man makes a joke at a woman's expense, he will gladly ignore the context, focus on the insult, and run with it as proof of misogyny. With certain online feminists, you have this problem where they will gladly not address any legitimate concerns you raise with regards to men's issues, and will instead look to pigeonhole you because you either oppose their views or because you look a certain way, thereby negating any intellectual discussion on subjects that affect men and or women. By doing this, these particular feminist channels spend too much time with the manosphere and none dealing with women's rights where they are very much denied. They are, at that moment, movement, nothing more than a lipstick feminist who is looking to argue with men solely for being a man. Speaking from personal experience, being labelled an anti-feminist, MRA or avatar in a suit, does nothing to add to the conversation and only provides that feminist a very weak way out of engaging with points made against them or their movement. Which is in stark contrast to quite a number of MRA channels that, much like Bain here, use an exceptional amount of sources and evidence to support the need for certain rights being denied to a lot of men. Now, I don't understand why being labelled an MRA defeats any argument presented, dismisses it even, or is somehow a bad thing. Granted, the media and certain hate groups have done a fantastic job at painting the MRA with a brush, a very tainted brush, but it is a pretty weak move to make an assumption. Hell, some of these feminist channels would claim to use evidence to sustain their arguments. So why do this? Why simply assume someone is an MRA or call them an MRA and move on? The only thing I can think of is if they are trying to use it to derail discussion, or even to simply move on without addressing anything, like earlier stated. I am curious what the benefit is of a feminist channel to solely focus its attention on content creators that oppose feminism. As most of these channels don't seem to address the points, it is logical to assume they do it because they want to create drama with heavily quote-mined, misrepresenting and abusive content that only adds to the fire of anti-feminist content, videos of which will debunk the worthless content and then point out the peculiarity of one's borderline obsession with anything but women's rights.
A special thanks to Little Miss Anonymous, Felfop Returns, and Omegon for their guest spots. Next episode will continue with the most common arguments used against the men's rights movement, and there will be more guest spots. So stay tuned for that. Coming soon.
Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about the do-nothing MRA. Well, let's say the constructive do-nothing in our MRA, because of course the MRA is famous for doing all kinds of things, all of them odious. It's just the boys' club where they can put the big "No Girls Allowed" sign outside, and then they can go inside and complain about how women want to be treated exclusively and differently than men. Don't represent me, demographically or politically, because I consider them to be nothing more than a hate group. But I did want to bring this up because I've constantly heard refrains online about how the men's rights movement is needed because feminists aren't doing anything for men. And I've talked about here in the past where feminism is covering every single base that the MRA says that it isn't. Every single thing that the MRA says the feminism isn't doing for men, feminism has been doing for men for decades. Whereas, as this profile and article will show, the MRA itself, other than whining like spoiled 13-year-olds on the floor, does nothing. Nada. This is just a group of whining children. That's all. They have so much privilege, and the idea that someone else is going to end up having the same types of treatment that they have absorbed to the point where they can't even see anymore enrages them. How dare you think that you're equal to me? These people are fish and they can't see the water they swim through. The privilege that they experience every single day. And when they're told that they're going to be people who want to be treated the same, who want to be able to walk from their home to their car without being verbally harassed, that want to be able to work out in the gym without being hit on, that want to be able to have a job at a factory, an office, and not have people policing their clothing, or making comments about their weight, or make references to their sexuality if it doesn't fit some definition that the society at large says. And these are the things that members of the MRA have experienced none of. They don't have to worry about these problems. That's the privilege. They're not afraid to walk down the street. They don't fear that person walking up is about to hit on them or make something rude comment. They don't worry about that because they're privileged. That's what privilege is. You were just completely and utterly ignorant of all the things that you don't have to worry about because you are blessed with that privilege. It's taken me decades to come to understand the level of privilege that I have as a white, straight male in Western culture. It was shocking to me when the first time I found out from my wife and my female friends what they dealt with every day. That it never occurred to me, not for a second, that women were around me were nervous just because I'm a big guy walking down the street. And it broke my fucking heart when I figured it out. And I wasn't mad at those women. I didn't blame them for it. I put the blame where it belonged, on the douche nozzles that are in the MRA, the foot soldiers of the patriarchy. That's where I put the blame. That's where the blame belongs. I don't blame the women around me that are nervous when I walk down the street. I empathize, I sympathize, I have compassion for them. And I wish I could show them that they honestly and truly have nothing to fear from me. But I can't. Because 1,000, 10,000 men before me have proven to them that I can't be trusted. That even though I am not guilty of anything in this case, I bear the burden of my brothers. I don't want it. I didn't ask for it. But I know that in my lifetime, within my privilege as a straight, white, cisgender male, that I have harmed others. That in my ignorance, I stepped on people's egos. I hurt them with words. I staunched their speech. I was a douche nozzle. And I can't ever change that, what happened in the past. But I can stop doing it. And I can talk about the fact that other men need to stop doing it. And I can talk about douche nozzle organizations like A Voice for Men. Men who've had the bullhorns in their hands for centuries, for millennia, complaining that when a woman speaks up in the corner of the room, that suddenly she's taking over the conversation, while they still have that bullhorn grabbed tight in their fist. I'm tired of these asshats. I'm tired of bearing the burden of what they've done to society. And I'm going to do what I can to make it right. And as an aside, anyone that ever uses the words social justice or social justice warriors as pejoratives, kick them out of your life. Gone. Get rid of them. They're belittling you. They're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to make the words social justice into dirty words. And they aren't. You don't need people like that in your life. And I can guarantee you, I'm not going to have them here on my channel. So if you'd like to discuss this, cool. But let's discuss it like adults. Any of the whining children of the MRA that want to come and plague my channel will be leaving. Without guilt, without hesitation. I don't need them in my life. They're not helping. They are the problem. But the rest of us that want to make the world a better place, we can have a conversation. We can do something. So, let's get started.